Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Thank you kindly for those gracious words. I'm a little worried about audiences when I'm introduced as a philosopher. At best, it's hard to know what to expect because a lot of things come under that label. And the word is that philosophers are able to go down deeper, stay down longer, and come up drier than anyone else. So now I'm going to try to ease the pain this evening as I talk to you about a topic that I think is of such great importance. Veritas Forum originated in a setting where there was a feeling that somehow important truths were not being discussed. Veritas, truth. And you may know the history of the Harvard Shield that has that word on it. It also from time to time had the word Christo on it, Christ, and Ecclesia, church. And they have sort of come and gone, and Veritas has stayed there. And we can be thankful for that. Veritas is an important topic and not a very popular one on the campus. There are various reasons for that. We won't bother about them here. But let's move on to the topic tonight, which is moral truth and moral knowledge. That's one of the least welcome kinds of truth to get discussed. It's very important to understand where we stand today. And the words on the board, what your university won't teach you. And I want to explain what I'm going to say to you, and then say it, and then it's question, comment time. So you will have plenty of time to make your observations and raise your questions, and I'll do the best I can to respond to them. What is it your university won't teach you? What it won't teach you is moral knowledge. It will not teach you good and evil, right and wrong. Many people do not know this, especially outsiders to the university, but many people in the university don't either, and I'm going to be talking about that. They still have the impression that somehow good and evil, right and wrong are taught in the university system. That's a natural assumption, because the history of the university is one where that was the most important things to teach. And after all, isn't the university still the university? But things have radically changed. There are reasons for it. We'll be able to talk about a few of them tonight, not all of them. But there are reasons why it is no longer true that the university offers, as knowledge, a body of moral truth. So I'm hoping now you see that, what your university won't teach you. There's no department that does that. The closest you get to it is freshman orientation. And that's largely because the university knows it can get sued for certain kinds of things. And believe me, that's a serious issue, because we're talking many, many dollars, and we don't have them to throw away. And so you do have a number of things discussed, and then you have a few things that are discussed perhaps in class or in the handbook about plagiarism, for example, and cheating, stealing data, and things of that sort. But interestingly enough, and you may want to disagree with this, and I encourage you to disagree with anything that you feel needs disagreeing with, and we'll do the best we can. Interestingly enough, among the students and among those who enforce the handbook, plagiarism, cheating, and so on is not really dealt with as a moral issue. It is dealt with as a kind of technical issue under the rules of the university. And you may have some explanation of why there is such a rule, but people who offend against those rules are not subjected to moral opprobrium and disapproval. And in fact, most people who are responsible for those rules and their application would think it was immoral to address them with moral opprobrium, because moral opprobrium is a very painful thing. And while there's not made available a body of moral knowledge, still moral life goes on. So that's now what I want to say to you mainly, that I want to say that there is a version of morality that is communicated, not officially as knowledge, but communicated tacitly by the way things are arranged in the university, by body language, by tones of voice and looks, and what is selected for treatment and what is not selected for treatment. So you're apt to pick up a, dare I say, shallow and dangerous morality, because you can't stop the moral life from going, and you can't help communicate your beliefs. And if you're an influential person in a responsible position, those beliefs will be communicated, and people will receive guidance in their moral life without anyone saying anything about it. And that morality that is communicated because of the background assumptions is not itself subjected to careful, rational evaluation and critique. Now, that's what I'm going to say to you. Don't leave yet. Okay? Because I want to try to fill out some of the important considerations that go with this. What I call the disappearance of moral knowledge doesn't mean there isn't any moral knowledge, or that no one has it. It means that it has disappeared as knowledge content from the institutions of knowledge in our culture. Those institutions are primarily the university and its professional offshoots, and, you may be surprised to hear me say, the church. Because the church generally also no longer presents a body of moral knowledge. They have been undermined by the dominance of the university and its professional offshoots, particularly through the law. And you may want to explore some of those issues when we get into the discussion. But I present it simply as a fact. I list two things on this sheet that you may want to look at. One is an incident that occurred at the University of Chicago a few years back. A man named Mearsheimer gave the annual address to the incoming students, freshmen coming in. And he tried to tell them what they would get and what they wouldn't get by coming to the University of Chicago. And he told them, of course, they would develop their critical faculties and they would broaden their view and they would learn about other cultures and so on. And no one was upset about that. That's what we all say, and I suppose there's something to it. But then he said, there are two things the University of Chicago will not do. One is, they will not give you truth. An interesting claim in itself. I won't spend much time on it. But it's very common for people in the universities to say things like that. We don't give you truth. What we do is help you find it. But giving people truth is problematic. And in particular, Mearsheimer emphasized that it tends to shut down your critical faculties. Someone just gives you the truth. There's something to that, very important. And really in education, I often think it's more important that we give people the right questions than to give them the right answers. Because you can't really handle answers very well unless you've got some questions to hold them in. And we do need to cultivate people's ability to think. I don't think that's inconsistent with giving people truth as it is appropriate, but it's very important not to miss that point. The second thing that Mearsheimer said is we do not give you any moral guidance. We don't give you moral guidance. Now, what he had in mind was that the University of Chicago does not give students direct statements about what is right and wrong and good and bad that they can write down in their notepad and then think they know it. Particularly, if you read his discussion, he's thinking about traditional moral teachings. Actually, you can teach almost anything about morality if it's non-traditional and if you call it political. Because you see, politics doesn't require knowledge. It simply requires advocacy. And that's free game. So that goes on all the time in university classrooms. I know that some professors are more disciplined than that, and they don't do it, and they certainly have my applause. If you want to read this discussion by Mearsheimer and others, you can find it in a journal called Philosophy and Literature, Volume 22, from 1998, pages 137 and following. I really hope you'll read it, because what happened there was it republishes Mearsheimer's whole address. And then it gives the responses of 7 other faculty members from around the country, and a number of them at Chicago, very famously Wayne Booth at Chicago. And Wayne Booth is really well known around the country for his advocacy of moral education through literature. And so there were a lot of people that disagreed with Mearsheimer. But as the discussion went along, it was clear that the people who thought they did teach morality didn't really mean that in the sense that contradicted Mearsheimer. What they meant was they discuss it. They provide readings, illustrations from history. And it isn't show and tell in this case, it's show and not tell. You show the literature, you show the cases, and then you don't tell. You try to get the students to think it out and come to their conclusion. That's not a bad idea. But actually it doesn't contradict Mearsheimer at all. Mearsheimer was saying, we don't teach what is right and wrong. We don't teach what is good and bad. And actually, it turns out that when Wayne Booth and the others were done, his claim stood. His claim stood. Now, of course, the reason in most people's minds why you don't teach that is because there actually is, in their mind, no body of knowledge to teach. So you can't teach where you don't have anything to teach. You have to have knowledge to teach. And there isn't any. The other reference here, Julie Rubin's book. I wonder, has anyone seen that book? I'll tell you, you need to see that book. This is a great book. Julie is a historian, took a degree from Stanford, wrote her dissertation on administrative developments in the history of, I think it was 8 or 9 of the leading universities in the United States. Marvelous piece of work. And it's a description of how moral teachings disappeared, officially disappeared, from the universities. And she does a wonderful job of collecting statements from catalogs, statements from presidents, a few trustees and faculty members that are very influential, just showing how it simply disappears. The short end of the story is simply this, that once theology disappeared from university curricula, There was no place to locate ethics. Religion, of course, has always been interested in ethics. Apparently, God is rather serious about these issues. But then theology, through a process I don't have time to describe tonight, but after the Civil War, when the universities and colleges were changing with great rapidity to respond to the situation in the United States, theology simply disappeared. And it disappeared partly because people realized that it really was not a friend of research. And that in theology, the various denominations were defending stuff that could not be defended. And so gradually it dropped out. And in recent years even, there were still universities that had departments that combined religion and philosophy and maybe some other subjects. But theology itself has disappeared in favor of religious studies. That left ethics and moral knowledge without foundation, and it had to be relocated. Where would we relocate it? Very interesting. Julie tells the story how first they tried to locate it in the sciences because they thought the sciences were above all concerned about truth, so it's a natural place to locate the teaching of ethics, the teaching of morality. Well, it didn't quite work that way. And there were rationales to the effect that all truth is God's truth, moral truth is truth, scientific truth is truth. But it didn't take but a few years to realize that you couldn't do much with ethics from within the sciences. Actually, that's a very complicated story, and I wish I had time to tell you about how that worked, but that's the way it came out. You could not base ethics in the sciences. There was a lot of toying around with Darwin and biology and so on, but it simply doesn't work. So administrators then tried to locate it in the social sciences. Social work was a field that was blossoming at the time. Sociology had been developing for some time, first in France, and very largely along Christian lines, though when Auguste Comte got a hold of it, that went out the door. Social sciences tried, but they couldn't lay a foundation for thou shalt not steal, and so forth. And actually, it's quite a trick if you try to do that from the social sciences. So they turned it over to the humanities, with the idea that, well, humanities were interested in truth and beauty and goodness and all those sorts of things. And you have a season where that looked rather promising. If you know, for example, the writings of Matthew Arnold and some people influenced by him, it looked promising. But before long, it was clear it wouldn't fit there either. And so it just disappears. It no longer has an administrative home. And that's another thing that makes it very clear that, in fact, moral knowledge has disappeared. Student life stands there holding the bag because it's such an important thing that it can't be given up concretely, and one thinks there ought to be some moral regulations about roommates and how you take tests and so on. But in fact, it doesn't come over now as moral teaching. Again, you may want to disagree with that, and I hope to learn from you when you do. Now, moral life, of course, goes on. To say that moral knowledge has disappeared is not to say that morality has disappeared. Morality can't disappear. It's too important. It's one of the primary ways in which human beings view their own lives and their relationships to others. So, moral sentiments, moral beliefs, moral traditions, and we've learned to respect those on good grounds. Bitter moral opprobrium flows. We now have a politics that is basically a politics of moral contempt. As you listen to how people deal with one another, morality keeps a presence. We can't live without it. the peculiar kind of distancing, rejection, and scorn that goes with moral opprobrium. There is a peculiar way in which we treat others when we're in the moral realm, and in which we associate or don't associate with, distance from them, and so on. It's quite a peculiar range of reactions. The point here is simply that these were not reactions that involved or were based upon knowledge. That's the great difference. And really, in most schools, universities, and most public institutions, up until the Second World War, there was still a wide acceptance of a teaching about morality that was fundamentally a refined version of the Judeo-Christian teaching about morality. It was accepted as such. People based decisions on it, and those decisions would be unchallenged. It was in a period that begins after the Second World War that this is increasingly not so. And the challenges to morality that begin to associate it with religion and the issue of separation of church and state begins to affect ethics. Because after all, the Ten Commandments are in the Bible, right? Isn't that religion? So the confusion between religion and ethics still continues up to today. And so much of the literature around the university is a part of pushing morality out of the domain of knowledge. You identify ethics with religion. Religion is not knowledge, so morality is not knowledge. It doesn't make a lot of sense often. If God had given Moses the Ten Commandments along with the multiplication tables, we wouldn't be able to teach the multiplication tables in our schools because they'd be religion. They're in the Bible. Right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, but you can kind of understand the connection when you think about it. People still make choices. They still have to be guided. They're often guided by moral sentiment, moral traditions, and so on, but not by moral knowledge. Now, I want to suggest that this is a case of failure of intellect. I want to tell you a story from Robert Coles. I think many of you will know Robert Coles. He's one of the most well-known and certainly admirable people in the public scene on the academic side. Teaches at Harvard. He published a little article titled, "The Disparity Between Intellect and Character." It was occasioned by an interview with a sophomore student who had been in his courses on moral reasoning, but was on the verge of leaving Harvard because of the behavior of fellow students toward her. She was working to pay her way through Harvard. Work scholarship, you understand those kinds of arrangements, and she cleaned rooms for her fellow students. They were often discourteous and disrespectful to her because she was having to work. And one in particular repeatedly propositioned her for sex when she came to clean his room. Now, he was making all A's, and she had taken 2 moral reasoning courses with him. Now she says to Robert Coles, "What's the point of knowing good if you don't keep trying to become a good person?" What's the point? Now, what's interesting in this story, many things are interesting in the story, but one of the things that's interesting is how Coles interprets the problem in the case of the young man. He interprets it as a disparity between intellect and character. That everything you need can be right there in the intellect and it not affect the character. That's a popular way of thinking. It's really associated with the way we've learned to talk about belief in religion. And we have a kind of popular psychology in this country that says there's a problem with connecting what's in your mind with what's in your heart. And that you can have it all right there in your mind and it have no effect on your heart and on your behavior. I want you to think about that. Think about that way of understanding human behavior. So Coles is going to look at this and try to understand the problem of putting into action what we have understood is good and right to do. And no doubt there are problems there. But to put the issues of behavior entirely in terms of some alleged general disparity between intellect and character does not do justice to the fact that problems often may be due to what is not in the intellect. One reason why the intellect doesn't affect behavior is the wrong thing or nothing is in the intellect. I want to suggest to you that you might think about the case with the young man who made A's and who behaved in a degrading way to his classmate. Is that there wasn't anything in the intellect to help him. Now, why was there not anything in the intellect? Well, because the courses that he had taken were not courses in which you discussed in some detail what was wrong with doing what he did. And in the contemporary context, it's very rare to find anyone who would be courageous enough and intelligent enough to talk in detail about what is wrong in sexual behavior in an ethics class. Very hard to find anyone who would do that. And for all of his virtues, Robert Coles, you can be sure, did not discuss that. So then when the young man who makes A's in his course does this thing, it isn't that the young man had the right stuff in his head and failed to bring it down to his behavior. He didn't have the right stuff in his head. No one had taught him. No one had posed this case and said, now what are the consequences of that kind of behavior? Look at it carefully. Is that kind of behavior respectful of people? No one had said, what kind of a person would do this anyway? You want to be that kind of person? See, that's the kind of thing that currently cannot be discussed generally, precisely because it is assumed that we don't have knowledge of that kind of thing. So we can discuss back and forth, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, is Kant right or is Mill right? Or did Aristotle have anything to say about it? You can be sure Jesus Christ will not get mentioned. The single most influential person on Western culture and ethics, he will not be mentioned because he's dangerous. It isn't just because he's religious. He's scary. See, if you followed his teaching, we wouldn't have to spend millions upon millions of dollars dealing with sexual harassment in our culture. Did you know that? That he addresses it and tells you what to do with it? Now, at my university, every couple of years, everyone on the staff, faculty staff, have to go through a procedure, anti-harassment. It isn't because of the peculiar ethical fastidiousness of the university. It's because they know they will get their pants sued off of them if someone does something wrong. Not exactly a moral motivation, but a very strong one. It's very interesting to think about these cases. Now, I hope you'll think about the case here with Robert Coles. And the problem there is not the failure of intellect to connect with behavior, but the failure of intellect And the failure of intellect is not just on the part of the young man, but on the part of the teaching or the magisterium of the university. So now let's think a little bit more about why we can't teach right and wrong. Why is it we can't? Now there's some people who would say, well, there's no knowledge, so we can't teach right and wrong. Actually, philosophers have worked a lot on this issue, and I think there is a pretty clear understanding at present that has emerged that at least no one has shown there is no knowledge of right and wrong. That the word that goes out sometimes, that this has been demonstrated, is very far from having been demonstrated. It just isn't true. The second thing that is often mentioned is that the teacher would subvert the student's intellect if they taught right and wrong. The idea there is, and there's some truth to it again, is that when people get into right and wrong, they get all worked up and they're biased and prejudiced and pushing their views. And so we just should stay away from it. Well, if that were necessary, we should. But there's no special danger in this area that isn't also a danger in other areas. I've taken German classes, for example. I'm a very pushy teacher, insisting that certain things were right and wrong in German, not inviting disagreement or critical thought about the conjugation of a verb. Now, obviously, you could have a brutal, silly teacher that did that, screaming at students because they made a mistake, degrading them, and all of that. But there's no special thing about the teaching of morality that means you cannot teach what is right and wrong, good and evil, without subverting the intellect of people. Now, again, I acknowledge that historically that has often been done, partly because morality has often been taught in conjunction with religion or by people with religious views, and they were dogmatic and not open about that. All I'm saying is that's not necessary. There's no good argument at this level either. Finally, we must be pluralistic. Now, that's a good point, and we should. But then there's an interesting question, why? Is that a moral should? That we should be pluralistic? Actually, I think it is. And I think it should be. And I think we should be pluralistic. But the way to be pluralistic is not just to say we don't know anything or that everyone is right. Pluralism is a matter of holding opportunities open, of being considerate and thoughtful and careful. Actually, pluralism comes out of the teaching of Jesus that you should love your neighbor as yourself. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you're going to be pluralistic. That doesn't mean that you say everyone is right about everything, that there is no knowledge. It has to do with how you treat other people and how they treat you, and what kinds of opportunities and possibilities are genuinely offered to help them. But pluralism doesn't mean that everyone is right in morality any more than it means everyone is right in French or some other subject matter. Now, the next point I need to pay attention to is what I mentioned in my brief introduction, is that we actually do teach right and wrong, good and evil. We actually do. You cannot not do that. You communicate attitudes. You communicate values. Anyone who is an adult and who works and lives with competence and authority and effectiveness is going to communicate values. You cannot keep from doing it. This is where the well-known in some educational circles idea of the hidden curriculum comes in. The hidden curriculum is actually the most forceful and effective teaching aspect of a school. The hidden curriculum is what is taught to people by how life is arranged, how adults act, the body language, the way activities are set up, what happens in the mixing of students and faculty and students and students and faculty and faculty. And students learn this very quickly because they know that if they fall across it, they're going to pay a price. And they're likely to be hurt very badly if they don't have the values that are actually dominating the way things are set up. So we do teach it. And we teach the values that are actually operating, and it is a real good question for us to think about. What are the values that are communicated by the way our campuses are run, the arrangements for living, the behavior among the administration, faculty, before the students, how they treat one another? For example, in many academic settings, contempt is a fine art, and it is taught with great force. So much so that if you don't know who to be contemptuous of, you will yourself become an object of contempt. And it's along a wide range of different variables. But that's one of the things that we teach people, what to pursue. Some of the critics of Mearsheimer I mentioned a while ago listened to his talk and realized that he was advancing a certain view of success and prosperity for his students by telling them the wonderful things they would get out of a Chicago education. And it was the kinds of values that you would expect in a consumerist culture, highly individualistic, directed towards status and security. And you can't live on those kinds of values very well, especially with other people, and possibly not yourself. We do teach. It is impossible for adults in authority not to communicate their moral values. Now, doing so responsibly, we could do it responsibly. And to do that would mean that we critically and thoroughly show the weight of reason that applies to the values that we're actually living by. If we did that, that would be something worthy of the university. That would be using intelligence, information, to bring to bear on the rightness and wrongness of acts, on the goodness and badness of character traits and persons. That's the traditional work of moral philosophy. That's what Aristotle did. That's what Kant did. That's what almost everyone who taught moral philosophy did up to the turn of the 20th century. And within a few decades, that all changed, and it infected and influenced the rest of the culture, especially the rest of academic culture. Because there was a backing away of the role of the university as forming people. Do you remember in loco parentis? You remember that one? The university is in the place of the parents. And about that time, the university decided that the parents really were loco, and they were not going to take their place. I'm sorry, that was really bad. It's hard to resist. But they did. That's actually what happened. And increasingly, the responsibility for forming the minds and the characters of young people was backed away from. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's a fact. That's what happened. You can trace it out. That's a part of the story. And if, for example, the case of the young man that is in the Robert Cole story, if he had been carefully taught to think about doing the kinds of things that he was doing, that would have pulled him out of a sex-saturated culture and allowed him to start thinking in terms of values that he himself would very likely find reasonable. And you see, the task of morality always has been to enable you to do what you don't want to do and to enable you not to do what you want to do. That's the role of morality, is to direct desire to what is good. Now, I understand the problems with coming to an agreement on those things, but actually those problems are much less than they're normally thought to be. And you get thoughtful people together who are able to sit down and weigh the evidence on things. They'll come up with pretty well what the rules of traditional morality have taught. And they'll do it on the basis of good reasons. But we're living through a period where anything that is traditional is automatically suspect. That's above all true of the main source of ethics in the Western world, which is the ethics of Jesus. The ethics of Jesus is an ethic of love, to love God with all your being and your neighbor as yourself. Now, actually, that's not the full story, but that's sort of like the minimal version. That your life is to be a life of love. God is presented as the greatest value in life, the greatest source of goodness. So you love that, and then on the basis of that, you love your neighbor. You care for your neighbor as yourself. You care for your neighbor as yourself. So that means you care for yourself. Now, care or love means you seek what is good for the one who is loved. You seek what is good for them. Aristotle, long ago, pointed out that self-love means to seek what is best for you. That isn't necessarily the same as what you want. Everyone knows that you can want things that are not good for you, except small children. They don't know that. They have to be taught that. And that's one of the jobs of parents, is to teach them the difference between what they want and what's good for them. And actually, they learn it very well if they're given teaching and training and example. The ethic of Jesus is one that until the end of the 1800s, roughly, I'm speaking very roughly, until the end of the 1800s was accepted as knowledge of what is good and what is right and wrong, with appropriate refinements. We always need those. Now, here's a statement from Jürgen Habermas about the teaching, the ethic that underlies what he would call European civilization. We get to be that even though we don't live in Europe. Here's what he said. Christianity has functioned for the normative self-understanding of modernity. Now, this language is philosophical language. I read this to a group the other day, and a lady said to me, that sounded real good, but I haven't the foggiest idea what it meant. Okay, so hold on. Christianity has functioned for the normative self-understanding of modernity as more than a mere precursor or catalyst. That is, more than something that just set up the present. Egalitarian universalism, the English of which is everyone is equal, from which spring the idea of freedom and social solidarity, of an autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, of the individual morality of conscience, of human rights and democracy. So that's his list. All those things. Is the direct descendant of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there is no alternative to it. And in the light of the current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this. Everything else is just idle, postmodern talk. Now, that would have not been surprising 100 years ago, or even 80 years ago. It came as a great shock to the learned world when Habermas turned this loose. And he got out on the internet and everyone was waving their hands and saying, well, look at this. It's a simple statement of fact. Simple statement of fact. You can confirm it in your own studies. Now, the moral basis of justice is love. A lot of the confusion in the moral realm from today, in my opinion, comes from thinking that you can have justice without love. But you can write it down that justice by itself will never do justice to justice. Justice is not the end of the story. And if you try to tell it as the end of the story, you won't get justice. You'll get a bunch of angry people. It is love that enables justice to flourish. Now, sometimes things are so bad that we just need to worry about justice. Okay, I agree with that. But that's not the place you stop. And what I'm saying to you is you have to move on to love. And the teaching of love, which is a word that ethicists will rarely say except when they're pushed, and I have a whole string of them who current thinkers that when they're pushed do finally manage to say it. Some will use benevolence, which is just goodwill, benevolence, and it means love. But you see, you can't say the word love and you can't say the name Jesus. So you try to think up something else. Nothing works very well. He brought us an ethic of love that can be based upon knowledge. He not only taught us what is right and what is good, but responding to the motive of ethical thinking from the very beginning. He also shows us the way to actually do what is right and to actually be good. Now that's what Socrates and Plato, for example, were primarily concerned about. They were not just concerned to define good. And of course, Plato said you couldn't. You can know it, but not define it. But what he was concerned about was to build a world in which people actually did what was right because they knew what was good. Aristotle, in his own ways, working on the same project. The Stoics and the Epicureans in Greek culture withdrew from that project because it was too big for them. They recognized that somehow human beings couldn't do it. And so they gave different advice. Epicurus and the Stoics gave different advice as to what was the wise and prudential course of action, which was basically cut down your expectations and stick to what is in your power. And apparently creating a wonderful republic is not in human power. And Plato himself had suggested that. Jesus comes and introduces us to a republic which is already in existence and which we can enter, which he calls the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of the heavens. And the Christian ethic, which developed through centuries to be the ethic, insofar as there was one, wasn't perfect and certainly was not perfectly followed, of European civilization, was an ethic that presupposed the presence of God in human life that would enable them to rise to the level, I'm cutting a lot of corners here, but to rise to a level where they could actually do what was good and what was right and not just talk about it. And part of that was because, unlike the Greeks, that ethic dealt seriously with evil. Not only recognized it, but also understood it and taught about how to deal with it. And that's one of the great weaknesses of our day, is that we cannot deal with evil. And we have a basically Platonic view that if people are into what is bad or what is wrong, all they need is education. And that would be true given the education. But what is the education to be? Obviously the one we've got doesn't help an awful lot. That goes back to the central theme that we've been talking about. Now, for Jesus, we have the famous teaching that enables us to actually do what he says, and that is the teaching that the truth will set you free. This is a teaching not about truth in general, like aerodynamics, for example. Actually, aerodynamics does set you free. It enables you to fly. So you're free to fly because of aerodynamic truth, and people didn't always have that. So it is a bigger story. But what is being discussed in this passage is so famous, and these words are written on more university walls than anything else except what's written in spray paint. The idea that the truth will set you free. It's written on my building, philosophy building at USC. It's all over the place. But actually, he didn't say that. What he said was, if you continue in my words, that is his teaching, that is the knowledge that he supplies. If you continue in that, you live in it, you dwell in it, put it into practice, then you are my students or apprentices. Disciples is another word, but it's kind of lost its teeth. So, students. You're my students. You're my apprentices. And you will come to know the truth of what I say, because you will bring it up against reality and see that it matches. See, truth is basically accuracy of representation. You will know that what I'm telling you is true. Well, what's he telling us? Well, things like, love your enemies. Or start with love people who bug you and move up to enemies later. Just put it into practice. Love your neighbor. Love one another. Now remember, that means live in goodwill to those around you, including yourself. You're around you, aren't you? You're your closest neighbor. And then your family, and then the people you work with. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That is to say, it will enable you to do the right and the good that you know. And you will get out of that position of not doing what you know to do right and doing what you know to be wrong. You remember that one? That's the universal condition of human beings. They can't do the good they know to do. Now, that isn't universally true, but it's generally characteristic of human life. It's important to understand that the teachings of Jesus reaches that far. The truth will set you free. Deliverance from the practice of evil. How does that come? Well, it comes from learning to live in the community that is called the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is basically where God is in action. That's where the kingdom of God is. Theologians say the kingdom of God is God reigning, governing. It's God in action. So you find out what God is doing and you step into it. And you do that by taking the teachings of Jesus and putting them into action. Now, to do that, you have to trust Him. You have to think He's worth trusting. But then you put them in action, and then that leads you to know the presence of the kingdom of God in your life so that you can actually learn to do what He said because it fits with moral and personal reality. That's the truth. That's how it works. That is an ethic that can be presented as knowledge. So now, people of intellect and erudition today routinely reject the person and teachings of Jesus. They have Him classified over in an area which makes Him irrelevant to life. Sometimes religious people have that. They don't give serious consideration to Him but live in a prejudice about him rather than being thoughtful. Here's an illustration. Arguably, one of the most significant alleged events in human history is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Pretty clearly, if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here tonight. There wouldn't be any Veritas Forum. There wouldn't be a Christian church. But you cannot get a historian to look seriously at that on pain of their life. Now, some have, of course. It's been thoroughly examined, and there's a lot of literature and teaching that comes out of that examination by people who approached it in order to prove that it was wrong. To my knowledge, which is limited, there has never been a case of someone who approached it to prove that it was right and decided it was wrong. But there's a whole string of people who approached it in terms of the best historical evidence and have decided that it was right. But you won't touch it. Because you see, if that happened, that will undermine the whole secular system of knowledge. Now, I don't know how you brag about LSU here, but out on the coast, the West Coast there, we brag about universities in terms of being secular universities. We brag about that. That goes right in there with research universities. So secular, research go together. There's a lot that could be said about that. We don't have time for it tonight. They go together. George Bernard Shaw used to make fun. He was a very clever, though shallow man. And he used to say that the phrase Catholic university is an oxymoron. The idea was that if you were Catholic, you couldn't possibly be worthy of a university. You couldn't be open-minded. You couldn't be thoughtful. You couldn't be critical, and so on. I don't know, some of you may be Catholics here tonight. You might take a little offense at that. I think you should. And I will tell you that if Catholic university is an oxymoron, secular university is every bit as much an oxymoron. So next time you hear that phrase, you may want to think about it. Because you see, there are some open questions here. Is reality secular? Well, we're still waiting on a demonstration. And frankly, the possibilities don't look that good. Can we stand on secularism as if it were a proven fact? I don't think so. In these matters, if someone says there's a proof, we want them to present it, don't we? In fact, that is the way that a university should work. But instead of that, there is a whole range of things that are simply written off, and especially in the area of morality. So my last line there is, responsible intellect will test the truth about Jesus Christ and the truth of His teachings. That would be responsible intellect. Finally, the moral teachings blindly conveyed by the practice of the contemporary university are very dangerous. Basically, they teach two things as ultimate values. One is pleasure, sometimes mistakenly called happiness, and the other is freedom. Pleasure degenerates into sensuality, and we have now a culture that is basically sensual. That is, feeling is what justifies action. It's what justifies action. Value good does not unless you have a feeling about it. And what do you want? What do you choose? What governs your freedom? In a sensual culture, it is, of course, pleasure. And now, I hope you will argue with me about this, but I think that is basically what we teach by how our life goes in the academic and professional world generally. Sometimes other words come up like success or even efficiency, but fundamentally it is pleasure and doing what you want that governs the life that we teach. Now, I've said a lot of things. I'm afraid some of them were provocative. Maybe that's a good thing. But I think now I want to stop and see if you have anything to say. Thank you very much. And I hope you will understand that statements are welcome. I want to hear what you think about what I've said. For one reason, I'm bound to be publishing on this stuff. That's what we do. And I'd like not to publish anything wrong if I can help it.
Just to let you know, we're recording the session this evening, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll get the microphone to you so that we can get your question into the mic as well. So, any questions?
Here's a...
I'm just wondering if you would be willing to speculate a little bit further about what you think is at the root of this change that's taken place.
Well, now you are a philosopher and you understand many of the issues that go into the problems of knowledge. What is, I think, most fundamentally at the root of the change is the changing conception of knowledge itself. So that up until well into the 20th century, it was possible to have an ethic where knowledge was based on intuition, G. Moore and Ross and Pritchard and those people. Intuition of things that are not a part of the physical world. But with the rise of positivism, which is not just a philosophical movement, but a cultural movement, and of course it comes out of the 19th century and develops along with empiricism for a while and then takes a new expression side by side with existentialism in the 30s. And I think that has had tremendous effects. So the problem here is at least as much with how we conceive of knowledge as with how we conceive of morality. But I think the shift in what counts as knowledge is really basic to this, and especially basic to the proposition of trying to turn this around somehow. Because we are now in a period where actually, at universities I'm familiar with, we don't talk much about knowledge. We talk about research. And research is defined in a particular way that does not allow for knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong. It allows for knowledge of behavior, for opinions. You can do all sorts of surveys and so on, but you never take the position of saying from within sociology or much less chemistry and so on, what is morally good and right and wrong. I think that's the big issue. So the problem really lies at the feet of people who are thinking about this more than anything else. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think it's possible that this understanding that we have now about the nature of knowledge, and I agree with all that you've said, but is it possible that that there is an unwillingness to be obedient to any kind of authority?
Well,
could even lie behind our decisions about what counts as knowledge.
Yes. No, I think that's right on. And it works at a spiritual level. It's the drive of human beings for mastery. That's what underlies all of this. And you think, see, if you listen to people who might take seriously something in traditional morality or religion, it always comes up against this thing, well, human mastery must be ultimate. And if you don't, human beings have this illusion that they can master nature. It's what I call the Faustian motivation back of modern civilization. This idea that we can master nature, and of course, we're not going to do that. C.S. Lewis, in his little book, The Abolition of Man, has a lovely discussion of why we can't. But basically, it's simply that our choices will be controlled by nature if naturalism is true. It will be controlled by nature, so nature will master us through our desires and our choices, and it will come in the form of a few people who have the power to run the show. So I appreciate your comment, and at the spiritual level, I think that is exactly where it lies. It's the desire for mastery.
What would you say is the future for this trend? Where do you see it going in the next 10, 20 years, and what would you speculate is necessary for it to change?
I think that you can't think of a deterministic future on this. I believe it's up to us where it goes from here. But I think that especially academic and intellectual people are going to have to turn around their vision of reality and value enough to where they will stand up and say, we have to go in a different direction. I believe that the leaders of the church, pastors and teachers, and Christians, especially Christians in academic settings, are going to have to lead the way. And that will mean possibly some real suffering, because that means we're going to have to take the bullet. And now, as far as I can tell, that's all in a day's work. And we're certainly no worse off than we were when this operation started 2,000 years ago. But we do have to, I think, see where the battle is, and it is over this issue of what counts as knowledge. See, we 100 or so years ago, the church basically turned knowledge over to the university and said, you do knowledge and we do faith. And now that's where we are today. You see, that we're in a different business, and then if you raise an ethical question, that's equated with faith, and that's to put it out of the domain of knowledge. So I think there is hope, but it's going to mean that individuals will rise up and occupy their calling to speak the truth and know the truth.
Prof, I know you're looking at the university settings, but in your presentation, you mentioned something about the role of the church.
Yes. And
the fact that the traditional way of impacting knowledge and truth to a large extent has been deviated from. And if you tie that question to this gentleman's question with respect to where do we go from here? And again, I mean, from my accent, you realize that I'm from somewhere far away. And then I look at I've been here for 26, 27 years, and like I mentioned, you see a situation in which it appears as if the church, and I might be wrong, is transferring everything to the political setting, whereby we are moving away from the Father. Christ said, His kingdom is not of this world. How do we balance this transfer of knowledge to current generation in a truthful manner, even before they get to the university? They are going back to the church, whereby the church is doing the traditional role of teaching people and impacting knowledge truthfully. Because right now we've deviated from the traditional way of church structure to independent churches where they can teach anything as long as they survive. How do you relate that to where we go from here?
I don't have a very glorious kind of answer. My answer is we simply need to do the hard work, both of following Christ and of careful inquiry and research, both of those. And we have to think about them in such a way that they're not disconnected or incompatible. And we need to have people in all settings who are serious disciples of Christ in the kingdom of God. And they are that when they are scientists, when they're teachers, scholars, intellectuals, pastors. And we need simply to apply the standard of truth and fair inquiry all the way down the line. And to the church above all. You see, the church falls into traditions that are not after Christ. And so we need people in the churches, as well as in the universities, as well as in the governments, throughout society, who will see to it that people know what truth is and how to follow it. And I think that's the answer. This gentleman here.
Professor Willard, thank you very much for coming. I teach primarily in a medical school, the LSU Medical School, and I teach mostly third and fourth year medical students and postgraduate students.
Right.
And I can tell you that we teach ethics still.
Yes.
I mean, if you want to say you want to behave in a certain manner towards a patient that is sexually, you're going to get graded down for that.
Mm-hmm.
And now to get graded down, you may not graduate.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to try to say that, gee, I'm tired, I don't really feel like doing something to help this patient right now, you say, suck it up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you learn that that's part of the ethic of being in medicine.
Right.
And I can tell you this, that the way I look at it, there's a tremendous difference in terms of people who've cultured and cultivated virtue.
Yes.
In the way that they may have the same intellect as somebody in terms of intellectual knowledge. When do you do this procedure? How do you do this?
Mm-hmm.
But those who've cultivated that ethic make a tremendous difference. Now, I'm sorry.
That's, I understand. Please go ahead.
My question actually relates more to another issue, and that is to coming to the common morality. And I was thinking as you were mentioning Christ and Aristotle, and Aristotle's picture of a virtuous person, You can't completely synthesize it. Many things overlap, but it doesn't really synthesize completely with what Christ said. I mean,
right.
He didn't have much use for humility or
benevolence
or some of these other issues. So,
Indeed.
Is it really possible, without incorporating eschatology and other elements of the Christian morality, to come to a common morality of what really is a good person?
Well, I think it is, but obviously it is possible to have a lot of disagreement. In our culture, we have tended to restrict knowledge to what you cannot disagree about. And I think that's a terrible mistake. It lays an impossible burden on knowledge. Julie Rubin, by the way, in the book I mentioned here, has a nice discussion right towards the end of rethinking the issue of what counts as knowledge. See, I think your question actually has an interesting bearing on your earlier statement about teaching ethical knowledge. And I think it makes most people, even that I know, even in medical school, back away from treating the things that you mentioned about behavior as morally wrong. Medically wrong, yes. And when you're a mentor or someone like that, you certainly put that in their record and it follows them. My sense is that not many people would say that because of this they are morally bad. That is where the hang-up comes, I think. And often it's precisely over issues, well, we can't agree on it, on what moral goodness is, what moral rightness is. See, in the case of professional ethics, there are many things that are so obviously bad. Just like I mentioned plagiarism and cheating in the university. And you'll hear people who stay far away from moral knowledge insist that these things are wrong. And the reason they give is they spoil the whole operation. Right? I mean, we know that cheating is epidemic. We know that people lie all over the place on applications and other forms. But it's not their sense that they're morally bad because of that. Now, some people might say, well, we just get rid of that and stick to things such as comes up in professional ethics. And the thing is that the professions are so closely tied to a public good that you can mark people off if they don't do certain kinds of things. In law, in medicine, in some other areas, even a rather questionable profession like journalism. There are some things that you just don't do. You don't make up stories. Well, we've had people who did that and gotten Pulitzers for it, but still. Now, those people, if you watch their behavior, they don't think of themselves as being morally bad. It's very interesting, the phenomena you're describing. And I certainly want to emphasize that I know you're absolutely right about the context of medical ethics. You just don't pass those people on if they do certain kinds of things, because the issue is so important that you can make it stand up. But if you were to try to put it on a moral basis, you would probably be shot down because it would be associated with something like religion. And if it were pulled into the courts on that basis, then I think it wouldn't stand up. But of course it won't be, because it's so important, and you folks in medicine are so crucial, and you have such good knowledge of what counts and what doesn't, that no one is going to come against you as far as the right to mentor people in that way is concerned. But it still, I think, leaves standing the issue, and precisely because of the sorts of things you mentioned in your question. I do think we have to find another standard of knowledge than agreement. And that is not just for this purpose, but thinking about knowledge generally. The definition or description of knowledge that I use is you have knowledge of something if you're able to represent it or deal with it as it is on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. But you can't make people agree with you. And there are all sorts of reasons why people disagree about things that are actually subjects of knowledge.
I have a question.
Yes.
You were talking about that Cole's example, and
Yes.
you said that the problem was intellect, or his not knowing the moral
That's right.
values.
That's
but
right.
I guess I may be looking at this at the wrong level, but thinking, Satan knows the difference between good and evil.
Right.
And I think maybe I shouldn't assume, but I think a lot of
Right.
people do know the difference between
Right.
good and evil.
Right.
But without Christ, how can we live a righteous life? We can't, according to Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess
Well,
I'm
some
not, maybe I
people-
have a
some
very...
people apparently can't with him.
That's true. All of us to some extent,
So
because we
now,
all continue to sin.
what I'm saying here is not that there's no problem here. What I'm saying here is there are other problems. And one of them is that we don't convey moral knowledge to people in our teaching. That's one reason why. I'm relatively sure, knowing kind of the situation that this would be, that young man had never had anyone help him see what was bad and wrong in what he did. And existing in the context of sensuality and sexuality that he lives in, he may have thought he was doing the girl a favor. And so we need to understand that there are other problems. But actually we now have a culture that has really disconnected understanding from behavior. And so I think we need to deal with both of those. And it may very well be that a part of the knowledge that is required would come from Christ. Certainly if this young man had listened to Christ, he wouldn't have done that. Yes, sir.
Dr. Willard, I was curious, is this an evolution of an idea that is occurring, or is there an intelligence that is driving us culturally now to think that there is no ability to know? In other words, is this something that is happening, one professor's writing, the next professor's picking up on it, or is there an intelligence behind it? Thought process through the...
Well, I think you may be asking about the Satan issue. Not necessarily. Well, I'm not sure what intelligence you would have in mind. And if I had to say anything, I would say it would be more likely a stupidity than an intelligence. But that's possible too, because a lot of things do run from stupidity. I don't think there's a conspiracy. Some people get into conspiracies pretty fast. My assessment of the situation is that folks, for example, in the universities, researchers, professional people, by and large, want to do what is good and right. But they always, unfortunately, find reasons that deflect them from that. And I think one of the important ones in our time is this idea that academic culture has to divorce itself from Jesus Christ. That is a major thought, that you cannot bring up that name. I like to counter that by saying, look at his consequences and you might figure out that he's the most intelligent man that ever lived. And if you think he isn't, give me who is. Okay. Suggest who is. Well, there's some discussion there because, there were a lot of things that if he were all that intelligent he could have do that he didn't do. Like he didn't give the relativity equations to James and John. He could have done that and we'd have been in bad trouble a lot earlier. Of course, he'd had to put it in Roman numerals, and that's hard. Can't do much with those kinds of equations in Roman numerals. Yes, sir.
Early on in your presentation, you mentioned separation of church and state. And can you expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, because how can we say it again, please? Early on in your presentation, you mentioned something to the effect of the separation of church and state is one of the. That is how some of it has come down. See, there wouldn't have been an issue of separation of church and state, and please believe me that in the sense that was understood for generations. It is a valid, important concept. So I'm not suggesting that we have a theocracy or something of that sort. Nothing like that. But see, it came to mean something else. And actually, when that became a social and legal reality, basically in the 50s and 60s, there had already been a cultural decision that the church didn't have anything to say anyway. If it hadn't been previously decided that what the church gives is not knowledge, there wouldn't have been an issue about, for example, keeping the Bibles out of the schools and no prayer and all those sorts of things. And those are long stories. So please, I don't have time to tell you all the things I don't mean by what I'm saying. I'll put it this way to simplify it and just be brutal about it. If it were thought that religion communicates essential knowledge of life, there would be no more question of separation of church from state in its current form than there would be of separating chemistry from the state. It's the prior growth of the idea that in religion and morality we're not dealing with knowledge that then turns the issue of church into one political tradition that is in danger of swamping the others. And therefore it becomes a legitimate concern in a pluralistic society. But it's that prior assumption that I'm trying to get at tonight and talk about that. Now, if that is reversed and a different understanding comes, you still have to deal with issues of church and state as that was understood, which is absolutely important and valid, but it is no longer understood in that way. Yes, sir. Here's it.
I'm having a hard time trying to apply what you said.
Let me get the mic.
They're going to record you.
That'll be official.
Yes.
I'm having a hard time relating what you said to teaching moral knowledge in the hard sciences. Right. I can see as a chemist, a physicist, or a mathematician the importance of personal example and influence on the administration. But I'm at a loss as a former teacher of physical chemistry to see what I would say different in the classroom,
probably
other than drawing attention to famous chemists or physicists who happen to have been Christians, and especially if that had something interesting to do with the scientific discoveries. I'm following, I think, what you're saying just fine if you're an academic in the humanities, but it's a little hard for me to see that in the hard sciences, and of course there's a gray area in between.
Right. I certainly understand that. I think that in many areas, much of what we teach today would be the same. The physical sciences do not directly concern good and evil, right and wrong. They don't. The personal lives of scientists do. I don't know if you remember some years ago, Mrs. Sakharov, when Sakharov was imprisoned in Russia, appealed to scientists in the West on the basis of their morality as scientists to protest what was being done. That's an old-fashioned view of the scientist. But it is one that establishes a connection between the integrity of the scientist and moral behavior. Now, I don't think you teach that in physical chemistry or in the sciences, except possibly by example. So there are a lot of the things that in mathematics, the professor sitting next to you, you don't deal with moral issues and religious issues because it's not in the subject matter. Now, how it impinges on the subject matter is a further question. Like, are there questions in mathematics or in any of the sciences that push you over into questions of religion and perhaps thereby into questions of morality? They're quite distant, and for most occasions I don't think it would come up. But it is interesting in the Rubens book how she points out that it was assumed that when morality lost its foundation in theology, the most likely people to take it over were the scientists. So they thought. And they thought it because the scientist was devoted to truth. And actually, that's an interesting possibility, isn't it? But of course, it won't work as an educational project. Yes, they thought that actually it would be the example of the scientist more than anything else that would set the moral tone. Because of their devotion and their integrity with reference to the truth. Thank you. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.